No one likes drafting the related person section of the proxy statement. At least I don't. I'm not saying you have to take a shower after you write it up, but still, today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of U's. It's actually not the disclosure I dislike so much, it's the actual item 404 is so difficult to read as you'll see as we get into it. And so I hope I only complained this one time about this disclosure, but I'm not enjoying making this video. I'm going to tell you that right up front. Okay, so companies are required to disclose information about transactions involving the company and director, executive officers, and other enumerated parties, promoters, and control persons in their proxies. So before I bring in our guest to discuss related person disclosures in greater detail, let me run down some of the basics. So item 7B of Schedule 14A refers to item 404 of Regulation SK, and then there are two halves of item 404. The first half, item 401, is the thresholds for when you have specific related party transactions that need to be disclosed. And then item 404B is more about the policies and procedures of the company. So it really should have been the vice versa, because when you actually draft the disclosure, you're going to draft a description of your policies and procedures and then talk about the specific transactions that are triggered. But we're going to follow this video in the format in the order in which the regulation is. So like I said, item 404 is lengthy, and you want to give it a straight read every year to make sure you refresh your memory about all of the details and nuances. All right, so triggers for related person transactions. Item 404A requires disclosure regarding any transaction since the beginning of your last fiscal year or any currently proposed transaction where the company was or is to be a participant, the amount exceeds $120,000, and any related person had or will have a direct or indirect material interest. Instruction 1 is the lengthiest instruction probably in all the SEC's regulations, but let's talk about a little piece of it here. Instruction 1 to 404A, it gives you the definition of related person. So it's a director or an executive officer of the company or an immediate family member. Director nominee or an immediate family member, and then 5% holders. So what does immediate family member mean? How far down do you go? Instruction 1 gets you pretty far down there, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, or as well as any person other than a tenant or employee sharing the household. So sometimes your insiders will forget to tell you about some relative that's living in their house, and that happens more and more frequently, or I guess it depends on what area of the country you're in or just how your family structure is. But sometimes you need to prod your insiders to remind them about that part of the rule. Under this Corp Fin staff interpretation, you have some gloss here on what sharing the household means, how far down you go, and you don't go to persons that are not legally related. This family stuff can drive you nuts. Here's another Corp Fin staff interpretation that limits the relatives who are in-laws, stepchildren, step-parents. So look at this interp if you want to get into the weeds. And you're going to have to get into the weeds. These situations do come up. What to disclose? So your disclosure in the proxy for item 404A will obviously depend on how many related party transactions you have. When I was working on the staff, I worked with REITs. And at least at that time, many years ago that I worked with the REITs, they had a lot of related party transactions. They were family-owned businesses that went public. So if you're working for a company that has some kind of family-owned nature to it, you're likely going to have quite a few disclosures in your proxy about related party transactions, but maybe not. But a typical company will have only a paragraph or two worth of disclosures about actual transactions that meet the thresholds. But some companies, like I said, might have pages. When you do have a related party transaction under 404A, the things that you have to disclose are, the person's names. You're identifying your insider who's got the related party transaction, the relationship that person is to the company, the person's interest in the transaction, including whether they're in a corporation, partnership, all that kind of fancy stuff, the dollar amount of the amount involved, and then any other information regarding the transaction that might be material to investors in light of the circumstances of the particular transaction. And this is where it gets challenging to determine how much to disclose. The term transaction has a broad scope. In item 404A, as you see under instruction 2 here, to item 4A, the term includes any financial transaction, arrangement, or relationship, or any series. So a series of related transactions must be aggregated in determining the threshold amount for potential disclosure. That can be important. Item 404A calls for disclosure if a company is a participant in a transaction rather than a party. And that's an important distinction because it's clear that the transactions by a subsidiary are covered. Being a participant includes situations where the company benefits from a transaction, but is not technically a contractual party, is not a party to the agreement. The instructions, item 404, detail a number of other situations in which disclosure is not required. Executive and director compensation, that otherwise would be disclosable under item 402 of regulation, SK, certain types of indebtedness. So you're going to want to read all the instructions again every year before you're drafting your proxy to refresh your memory. Okay, which indirect interests are deemed not material? So disclosure is only required if a related person has a material interest in the transaction, regardless of whether that interest is direct or indirect. Confusing to me. So, Instruction 6 to item 404A provides you with some outs here that a person who has a position or relationship with a firm or company that engaged in the transaction will not be deemed to have an indirect material interest within the meaning of item if it meets all this stuff. So I'm going to let our guests cover this part in a little bit more detail, but disclosure is required if a related person has a material interest in the transaction, regardless of whether that interest is direct or indirect. Remember, direct or indirect, that's important. Instruction 6 provides a safe harbor under which certain types of relationships will not be deemed material interests for purposes of this item 404 disclosure. And the materiality of any other kind of interest continues to depend on the significance of the information to investors in light of all the circumstances. So you're really doing a facts and circumstances determination here. And at the end of the day, for many companies, there could be too much disclosure about the related party transactions as those companies play it safe when things pop up in a gray area. And that's inevitable because the standard of whether a related person has a material interest in the transaction and the direct stuff is all facts and circumstances determination. There's not a bright line. So this can be tough for insiders to deal with. They might be identified and have their interests disclosed. Another thing that could be tough for insiders is that they have a relative working at the same company, and that lower level employee might wind up having their compensation disclosed in the proxy identified if it's over the threshold amount, $120,000. Yeah. Time period covered. You must include any transactions that pop up until you file the proxy. So it's from the beginning of the fiscal year that your proxy covers all the way up to the latest practicable date when you're about ready to file. Instruction 1A also provides that, if the related person transaction pops up at any time during that part of the year, it gets covered. It doesn't have to be a related party transaction that existed during the whole fiscal year. What to disclose about related party, related person transaction policies? I say related party a lot. In the regulation, it's called related persons, but I can't help myself. Your disclosure in the proxy for item 404B will typically be a few paragraphs long. You're describing the company's policy and the procedures. As I mentioned, this disclosure typically comes first, and then there's a disclosure about the specific transactions under 404A. So item 404B requires disclosure about the policies and procedures established by the company. Every company is going to have a related person transaction policy. While item 404B1 actually mentions that the material features will vary depending on the particular circumstances for a company, and they do vary, there's actually 3 examples of what this might look like in item 404B1. Item 404B2 requires identification of any transactions required to be reported under 404A that did not require review, approval, or ratification under the company's policies, or where the policies and procedures applied were not followed. So this is sort of a catch-all to force you to enforce your policy and to make sure you have a policy. So you're going to always provide disclosure about your related person policies and procedures, even if you don't have anything to disclose under item 404A, as noted in this Corp Fin staff interpretation. So here's an example of what that would look like from Cognizant. They describe their policy, and then they have this nice box broken out that says that they didn't have any 404A transaction during the past fiscal year. And then continuing on to the proxy. Item 404B disclosure is not required for small reporting companies. You can see that here in this CorpFin staff interpretation. Location, the SEC doesn't dictate where this disclosure goes, and it varies. Typically, it's in the standalone governance section. If you have a standalone governance section, that's where Alphabet's disclosure is in its proxy. Or it could be in the election of directors section where you're having that proposal, and that's where Prudential's disclosure is in its proxy. Typically, the caption for this section is pretty similar to the title of item 404. Related person transactions, certain related parties stuff, you get the idea. So let's look at a few examples. Here's how Prudential describes its policy, and then the procedures are described pretty broadly, which board committee administers it and how it considers the facts and circumstances that arise. And then Prudential has a paragraph about how the company may happen to do some business where its insiders are officers and directors at those other companies, and then its board committee has determined that those aren't indirect or indirect material interests. And then here's an example for Alphabet, pretty lengthy disclosure about its policies and procedures, a full page. And then Alphabet actually has 2 full pages of specific transactions that are triggered to be disclosed. Each has its own header. I love how they do that. That's not required, but that helps the reader digest each of these specific transactions. And then their section ends with a paragraph sort of like Prudential that there are arm's length transactions between our company and then the companies where its other insiders either sit on the board or do work as officers. I think that's a great way to handle it. My guests today are Aaron Briggs of Gibson, Dunn and Candace Jackson of Mayer Brown. Aaron works in the San Francisco office and worked previously for General Electric for nearly 6 years. Candace is in Chicago and has been in-house twice, working for U.S. Foods in Primerica. So they both can bring that in-house perspective to their job, which I find to be so critically important in my job. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So related party transactions, I know it's related persons transactions, but I just can't help myself as I think of myself taping the intro to this video, the basics of laughing at myself through the whole video because this is always my least favorite topic. So I'm so for Candace and Aaron to join us to hopefully straighten me out if I made any errors. And then I'll have to go back and edit any errors, but there's no errors. So Candace, do you find that it's hard for some officers or directors to remember to tell you everyone who's in the household?
I think that it can be. And I think that's where having a good strategic D&O questionnaire really comes in handy. I think some D&O questionnaires will structure the question by, putting the definition of household members in the back in an appendix, and then just asking the director or officer, are there any transactions between, the company and any of your immediate family members or household members? And usually you'll just get a no. But I think the better questionnaire question is to define immediate family and household members right there in the question, and then ask them to list all of their immediate family members and household members. Then you can still ask the question about whether they're aware of any arrangements or agreements or transactions between the company and those individuals. But at least this way you have a list and you can go and you can do your own homework.
Yeah, maybe the other point I would make is, and Candace read my mind on having like a usable D&O questionnaire, right? But sometimes you can also get this, tease it out through the interview process if you do interviews with the D&Os afterwards, because it could be an area that you could kind of walk them through to make sure they really understood.
So let's talk about a topic. Now we're getting into some sophisticated stuff about, do you include transactions that are related, that pop up during the fiscal year, but then they go away before the fiscal year ends? And, in talking to some practitioners, they find that it's somewhat of a gray area, that there's no case law in this area. But on the other hand, there could be circumstances where practitioners could look at this and say, well, wait a minute, of course you would disclose that because that's the way a lot of related party transactions are. They're only sort of for a moment.
I think for me, the way that I've always, understood it is, you will have transactions that are just, they're not ongoing. It was maybe a one-time vendor purchase, but it was for $500,000, or it was an acquisition for $50 million, but it was a finite transaction, and it's not ongoing at the end of the fiscal year, or it's not ongoing at the time that you're filing the proxy disclosure. You would still have to disclose it. There may be some situations that could be gray. Maybe there was a transaction that was, proposed or contemplated that was no longer contemplated at the time that you're getting ready to file, and it hasn't actually, it was never actually consummated. It was just abandoned, and it was just a proposal. In that sense, because the rule does require you to disclose anything that's a proposed transaction at the time that you file, in this case, maybe it's no longer proposed. So that could be a gray area. That could be an area where, it's not something that it came up, but then it died and you're not going to disclose it. But generally, a one-time transaction that pops up during the year, yeah, I would say it's disclosable.
I agree that the way the rule's written, it's in the past tense. And so it contemplates transactions that are over and done with, not just those that are ongoing. But I guess I could see a situation, if you have a transaction that's so brief or got interrupted that, the briefness of the transaction could be relevant from a materiality standpoint when you're walking through that.
So Aaron, can you talk about the instruction to item 404B? This is related, sort of. Can an insider resolve a related party transaction before they become an insider to avoid disclosure about that?
Right. So yeah, there is this instruction to item 404B, and so you can try to resolve it before the person becomes an insider. But from a practical perspective, I'm not really sure how much that gets you, because if you look at the way the rules are set up, it gets you out of talking about the item 404B disclosure, which is, when did a transaction not require approval or ratification under your policies? But it doesn't necessarily get you out of the requirement to disclose the transaction itself as a related party transaction under 404A. And so if you walk through 404A and those instructions and the definition of who's a related party, the SEC is pretty clear about, for directors and officers and their family members, if they were in that position at any point during the fiscal year or during the time period that you're disclosing for, you have to pick up the transactions that occurred during that time. So you can't really get out of that piece of the disclosure. And so I don't often see, I often don't see that instruction being utilized.
Yeah, I would generally echo that. 404A, what is a related party transaction? You do have to disclose transactions that occurred during the year that maybe predated the person becoming a related party. And the instruction to 404B is limited in scope to the disclosure that's called for by 404B. So you would still have a disclosable related party transaction. You just wouldn't have to talk about the policy implications.
So Candace, in my introduction and the basics, I got in the weeds a little trying to describe indirect and direct interest. Can you spend a moment on that, explaining that concept?
Sure. I like to give examples. I think that, it's a little bit easier to understand the concept when you think about, an example of what a direct interest is and what an indirect interest is. A direct interest would be, the company employs a household member of an insider, of a director or an officer, or, hires them as a consultant. So they are a direct participant in that transaction. They have a direct financial interest because they're being paid directly. An indirect interest, some examples of indirect interests are where, the related party or their household member is maybe, a 30% shareholder of, a transaction with the with a company's vendor. They're a 30% shareholder of the vendor or the customer, and they have an indirect interest in that transaction because they are a large shareholder of the entity. If the company sells a significant amount of assets to an entity, and the related party is the CEO or a substantial shareholder of that entity, that would be an indirect interest. So, they're not getting paid directly, but they have an indirect financial interest in the transaction itself.
So Aaron, you have a related person transaction. Now the hard question, how much gloss do you disclose in the proxy about it? What is considered material to investors?
Sure. So, as you're looking at 404, right, there are some line item requirements of the types of things that you do have to talk about for each transaction. And then, of course, there's this catch-all that says anything else that's material to investors, you need to include. And so for some transactions, once you've walked through all of the line item requirements, there's not a whole lot left that's significant that you really need to talk about. But of course, it's facts and circumstances. And so you really need to do a deep dive on the transaction and really understand the underlying economics to be in a position to make a call regarding what else might be material. So, a couple of the things that I tend to look for when I'm looking at a transaction are, provisions or terms of the transaction showing that it's not on arm's length, for the company. As well as contingencies in the transaction that, if triggered, it could significantly change the terms of it going forward. And so these are, two examples of areas where there's often, some material, information that investors might consider material that you'd want to consider including. It can be helpful to take a look at what some other companies have done in terms of how they've talked about similarly disclosed transactions to get a sense for the level of detail that they've provided. And then, for recurring transactions with different insiders, it's really important to think about what the company's historical practice has been and how much you're veering or not from that.
So Candace, putting on your in-house hat, what sort of processes do you see companies use to keep track of their related party transaction? How much diligence do you have to do outside of that D&O questionnaire process?
Yeah, so, you can't just rely on your directors and officers to tell you whether or not there were any related party transactions. As I mentioned before, when you have your list of all of the related parties, at the companies that I've worked for, we typically would run that list through our, accounts receivable and accounts payable systems. Are these people customers? Are they vendors? Determining whether or not there were any, transactions kind of on the corporate development M&A side of the house with any of those parties, especially if any of them, if there are any entities in which those individuals are significant shareholders of. And so, you really do have to take that list and do a little bit of legwork and do a little bit of homework because it is the company's responsibility to determine whether or not there were related party transactions.
So Aaron, how involved is the insider with this disclosure? How hard is it to convince an insider to agree to disclose a related person transaction in the proxy that sort of might fall in the gray area about the materiality of it?
Sure, right. So these disclosures can often be, sensitive for the insider. So it's maybe not a good idea if the insider is left to make the call as to whether it goes in or not. I usually think it's better for disclosure counsel to make the recommendation, right? And so in doing so, assuming that, your inclination is that you should disclose, I would kind of arm yourself with as much ammo as you can going into the discussion with the insider. So perhaps getting outside counsel to weigh in and agree with your position. Perhaps finding some examples of similarly disclosed transactions by other companies. Showing consistency with your historical precedent, if that's an option. And then also kind of with the gloss and letting the insider know that, this is an area that gets a lot of attention from investors and the SEC. So it could be, it is one of those more high risk areas in terms of the consequences of not disclosing something that really should be disclosed. And so if something's gray, companies tend to err on the side of disclosure here rather than not.
So where would you rate this disclosure on a scale of 1 to 10 on the fun scale? how fun is drafting this disclosure? For me, it's a 1.
It's really painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
it's not only me. Well, thank you so much, Candace and Aaron.
Thank you.
Thank you.